I used to hate reading. I couldn't focus for more than a paragraph. I constantly had to reread, and I gained almost nothing from it. Yearly, I would read 0 books. 6 years later, and now I read over 100 books a year. It's my favorite activity, fuels my creativity, and makes me feel more confident and intelligent. You probably know that you should read more, but how do we go about this in a strategic way to make sure that we don't have the regret of not reading and that we can finally cross off that New Year's resolution to read more? We'll go through 3 different stages, each with its own section for tips and tactics. If you're new here, I'm Wilson, and I make videos about trying to develop the habit of reading so that people can find the joy that I have found from it. If that sounds interesting, consider subscribing. Now at this point, probably the main experience you have around reading is a teacher forcing a book that they care way too much about every minute detail down your throat. This is a surefire way to turn off people from reading, potentially for good. But now, there's no pop quizzes, we can read what we want. So how do we start? Growing up, my twin was a reader. He was reading things like War and Peace, Ulysses in middle school. I felt like I couldn't compete with him, and wanting my own identity, no reading for me. I decided to go down the path of video games. Only to later learn at the end of high school that I'm kinda stupid. So to start my journey, I went onto his bookshelves and found the smallest book that would be considered a real book. The book was Prince by Michelangelo. I couldn't even get through 3 pages of this book. Felt like it wasn't even written in English. I struggled with it for about a week before I gave up, humiliated. My little flame for reading had been extinguished, and after this moment, I didn't read again for another year. In the beginning, the key is momentum. It doesn't really matter what you're reading, just about reading books cover to cover. The best place to start is not literature, real books. Instead, it's books that are dominated by pictures. Graphic novels, comic books, or manga. After my 1-year break, after trying to read The Prince, I stumbled across an intriguing book. See, my mom was teaching a graphic novel workshop to her art students, so she had graphic novels all over the house, and one of them stuck out to me. There was this little Casper the Ghost looking ass dude on the cover named Bone. I cracked it open and found giant pictures sprawling from top to bottom of the page. I could actually get through an entire page in one sitting without having to reread it, but I was hooked. By the end of the next day, I had already finished the book. I read a book. Turning that last page felt really odd. Something that before was so out of reach was now literally at my fingertips. I asked my mom if we had more, and it turns out we had the entire series. Through the next week, I read all of them. This catapulted me from reading nothing to, at the end of the next week, reading 8 books. Next up came Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Captain Underpants. Now, if you're a bit older, these books might feel childish, and that's fine. There are other alternatives, and we can look to what we already consume. What video games do you play? Movies do you watch? TV shows? I'm sure that there is a graphical interpretation of them. This is an awesome gateway into reading because you're already interested in the topic because you've seen it before. And the series format of it makes it so that you're not worried about what you're reading next. You have a very clear progression to follow. For the actual tactics, it all starts at the bedrock of reading every single day. I would start off setting the goal at 1 page a day, but if I found that was still creating too much friction and I was missing days in a row, I would lower it down to maybe a paragraph or even a sentence, whatever was getting me just to crack open a book on a daily basis. But how do we ensure that we're following this daily reading protocol? Simply grab a calendar and a Sharpie. Every day that you read, put an X on it. Once you have a few X's in a row, your only goal is to not break that chain of X's. But how can we make this even easier? First off is to carve out a specific space that you're gonna read. Where is somewhere that you don't spend any other time normally? Make this your reading space, whether it's a chair or a specific position on the couch. Now, if the only quiet space you can find is in your room, on your bed, you can arrange your pillows in a new format so that that is your reading space. Make sure that whenever you're occupying that position that you're only reading. Also, try reading at the same time every day. Is there a certain period of the day where you always tend to have some free time? Whether after you wake up, before you go to bed, or random points within the day. I found what works best for me is reading right before I go to sleep. Now, I read at other points throughout the day, but no matter what, even on my busiest days, I can could still find a few minutes just to get a couple pages done before I go to sleep. Added bonus being, it helps me fall asleep faster. Next is to solidify the idea that you're a reader. For me, the real gateway that got me addicted to reading was self-help books. Now, this is not for everyone, but for me, a nonfiction book that I can take the insights from and directly apply to my life, game changer. The thought that I was directly benefiting from the things that I was reading was intoxicating. Take a topic that you're interested in. For me, it was personal finance, and look up the top books and order them. But before you do, check the page count. One of the worst things that can happen is you can get psyched about a book, order it, and then it shows up, yeah, I'm never gonna read that. So try to keep it below 250 pages when you're starting off. Now, you can also go to the library, of course, and if you don't know what to read, speak to a librarian. They are some of the nicest people on the planet, and by the end of a 5-minute conversation, you will have an exhaustive list of books that you could never finish in a lifetime. Now, if there are no topics that you're interested in, pick a person. Search up if they have any biographies about them. But again, check the book length. Sometimes these can be extraordinarily long. So for this phase 2, the main thing is to order many books. This makes it so that if you don't feel like reading the book that you're currently on, you have many other ones to choose from that should sound interesting and get you engaged. Now, if you're unsure about what books to get next, start to build a backlog. If a friend recommends you a book, add to the backlog. You're listening to a podcast and they talk about a book, add it to the backlog. I started with just a notepad file on my phone, but write down the book and the author. And then whenever I'm thinking about what to read next, pull up that backlog and then order the book. When you have a number of books, spread them out around your living space. And instead of reaching for your phone when you're bored, reach for a book. One of my favorite places to read is on the toilet. This was normally a time where I'd just spend 5 to 10 minutes doom scrolling on my phone. But now I can get through about a paragraph. No longer are my completely asleep legs a sign of disgust, but rather productivity. Another fantastic way to reinforce the habit of reading is to involve your friends. Tell them about what you're reading. Teach them about what you're reading. This will help solidify the topics that you're learning. Then, take it a step further. Trade books with them. If you really liked a book and think they would like it, give it to them. But don't expect to ever get it back, because you might not. And now it's off to the big leagues. This is the phase where I would start mixing in fiction into our reading. Now, for many people, they might want to start with fiction, but for me, I needed to get the wheels turning. For me, that came from nonfiction. Follow your notes for whatever you think is interesting. You can even read real literature, but honestly, it's not critical. I still haven't read The Prince, and I never will. So for tips and tactics, the first one being one that I only started to implement recently, and I wish I did sooner. So I had this moment when I was visiting my sister in California. We were in a corner store getting seltzer water, and I heard a song. I was like, damn, this is pretty good. It's an Adele song. Is it new? Pulled out Shazam. Turns out it was from her latest album. I had just listened to the album not too long ago with my mom. I had completely ignored this song on the first try, but with fresh ears, it was flames. But when we read a book, we tend to think we extracted all the knowledge from it on the first try. Unsurprisingly, on the second read-through of a book, you can have completely different insights. Next up is the inevitable. You will run into a book that you just don't feel like reading. You've tried, you open it up, and it's just not interesting. Get in the habit of cutting off that book. Stop reading it, burn it, shred it, whatever. I know that all of the times where I had large gaps of not reading in my life were because I was stuck on a hard book that I wasn't really interested in. If you don't like the book, move on. There's far too many fantastic books out there to struggle with ones that don't jive with us. Now, in the beginning, I think it can be fine to keep count of how many books you're reading. In the beginning, it can be a source of pride and help to get the momentum going. But towards the end, you end up just getting through books just to increase the counter and not the actual point of reading, which is to learn. So you can still keep a counter. I know that I still keep count, but I only do it at the end of the year where I actually add up how many that I read. Throughout the year, it doesn't matter to me. At this stage, I would also spend time learning how to take notes properly in books to make sure that the learnings that we're getting from the books are actually being solidified and we remember them. Now, there are many ways of note-taking, and I'm going to create a whole separate video on note-taking, but in short, at the end of every chapter, or in parts that stick out to you, summarize them in your own words, in the book itself. I know it's kind of taboo to write in books, but if it's your book, write in it. I love going back and opening up a book that I read and seeing all the notes that I took. It can immediately place me back in the mindset of when I was reading the book, and it's much easier to find the actual insights that you learn from it. Now, at the end of every book that you read, transfer these notes to wherever you keep your notes, whether that's in a notebook or on the computer in something like Notion or Evernote. Now, this helps you just solidify them even more and makes it easier to call upon them when you need them, instead of having to go and grab the book. Now, before you actually go and write them, try to remember them from memory. Type out what you remember writing in the book, and then go back and see how close you were. Now, at this stage also, you'll probably reach a point where you have so many books that you want to read, but the only thing limiting you is the speed of your reading. Now again, I'm going to make a whole separate video about this because it's pretty in-depth, but the easiest tip to have an immediate effect on your reading speed is to use a pointing device. And that can be your finger, a pen, a ruler, whatever. But just follow along exactly what you're reading. You'll see immediately once you start following along, your reading speed will increase. This also should help keep you locked in and make sure that you won't have to read sections because you got distracted. You know exactly where you are at all times. So you've made it. Now you are a reader. But if you still want some book recommendations, specifically tailored for people that aren't the biggest fan of reading, check out my last video, where I give 10 book recommendations, 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction. Thanks for watching.